Please join me in welcoming our first panel on stage to delve into the topic Australia's fight against food waste. Where are we now? Where we'll be by 2030. Steve is the facilitator, and on the panel, Petah Rhynehart, the Director of Food and Organic Waste Section at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Mirjana Prica, who is the CEO, Food Innovation Australia Limited, or FIAL, and of course, Toine Timmermans. Let it rip, Steve.
Thank you, Pip. Well, I can see a few more people here. The lights aren't quite as bright. So let's get into it. We've had the introductions. You've heard from Toine already. Petah is with the Federal Department of Environment, and Mirjana is with Food Innovation Australia, or FIAL. For anyone that doesn't know FIAL, they are the Food and Agribusiness Growth Centre. That's the way we recognise it, Mirjana?
We sure do. Or we say FIAL.
FIAL. All right. So first of all, I want to talk about how we are tracking nationally against key plans. So I gave a bit of an overview through my talk around specific KPIs that are in national plans and a bit of an assessment. But I'm keen to hear from yourself, Petah, around how you think we're tracking. We've got a new government as well, how they think we're tracking, and really what's next, what's on the horizon.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. So if I could probably start by doing a bit of a performance report on Australia, I'd say achieved some really good results against key deliverables, has a lot more to do collectively across the country, but the good news is there's ambition from all corners. I saw your presentation backstage and you touched on the National Food Waste Strategy and the National Waste Policy Action Plan, and a lot has happened in the 5 years. Obviously we've got FIAL's roadmap, which sort of sets the framework for what we need to achieve, what we need to do to achieve the halving food waste target, and the resources required to do so. We've established Stop Food Waste Australia, and we work closely with Stop Food Waste Australia. What else? With Stop Food Waste Australia, we've got the voluntary commitment program with the Australian Food Pact, and it's really great to see how far the Pact has come in the 13 months since it was launched in October last year, starting with 8 signatories and now to 25. It's a pretty amazing effort. With the National Waste Policy Action Plan, obviously there are some things that have been delivered with the long-term governance entity and the Australian Food Pact, and your slide, did show the Support Fight Food Waste campaign. There is the perception that it's being delivered, and you mentioned Oz Harvest, and that was their Use It Up campaign. When they're looking at whether that action item has been delivered, they actually look at all the delivery partners. So it's the Australian government and the state and territory governments, and there has been work across the country on supporting Fight Food Waste campaign. I mean, we supported Oz Harvest, and there's some other work and grants underway to look into consumer behaviours. So technically they can't say ticket's been delivered. It's probably saying it's delayed at the moment. So that's 2.03. And then obviously, 2.13, which is the aligning community education efforts to maximise impact and reduce confusion. That's probably where the most effort needs to go, and we see the nationwide consumer behaviour change campaign as playing a pivotal role there. If you had have seen Mr. Plibersek's speech in full, you would know that she is 6 months into her role. She's very passionate, she's very ambitious. Waste and recycling is high on her priority list, and at the Environment Ministers meeting in October here in Brisbane, all ministers agreed to extend the date for the 2.13 action item, but they also agreed to expand the National Waste Policy Action Plan, so still deliver it, but actually strengthen it, make the waste and recycling targets much stronger. But in doing that, it actually takes collective work across the country, and they've acknowledged that this isn't something that the Australian government can do on its own. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of collective effort across government, NGOs, industry, business, research, academics to actually make this reducing food waste target come to fruition. On Minister Plebisek, yeah, she's very ambitious. She's switched on. We have the attention of her office, her advisors. They're very focused on food waste and preventing the generation of food waste. When we look at what would be required to deliver a nationwide consumer behaviour change campaign, it's going to take a lot of effort, it's going to take a lot of money, and the Australian government can't be seen as the one that delivers it all. It's going to take effort from everyone. We've probably seen and heard in the news that the government is in budget repair mode, and the Treasurer has even said that there's pain to come. So, and we know working in the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, that the budget is very heavily contested. So we really need everyone's support across industry and government to help bring this nationwide campaign together. Does that answer your question?
It does, but I'm going to take it a little bit further. I appreciate you work for the government of the day and you can't play favourites, but you know, if you were to rank, I've worked with 5 different environment ministers now, I think. Where's the passion levels here compared to some of the previous ministers?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure I can comment,
Okay.
but I can say that in the department we're really motivated to see that we've got the tick of approval to go forward and to put new ideas out there and to really champion our cause in the food waste section and really make it a priority for the government. I mean,
priority for government, that's what I want to hear.
Yeah,
so.
Priority for government indeed, and on the phone to the advisors you know, a lot this week even. But food waste is in front of everyone and we're seeing it. Minister Plebisek has children. She sees the waste that her children generate. I see the waste my children generate. My daughter tells her teacher that I'm the you know, food waste police, which her teacher had to laugh at. So it's definitely a priority, and one way or another, the government is very keen to have food waste at front and centre of consumers and householders, just to have that action to make them change their behaviours.
Thank you, Pia. Toine, you touched on before that you know, how the international scene in terms of what's happening around the world. Give us a clearer picture of how you think we're tracking, how the rest of the world thinks we're tracking. You're kind of a proxy with Champions 12.3, and you're involved in those international meetings. You know, I've always looked to the UK and the Netherlands as leaders in this area. Who are the other emerging countries at the moment?
Australia for sure, I already mentioned that, and that is because you're doing it systemically. And I think in the Netherlands and also in the UK, we have always been struggling, like we know what we need, but we never could do everything together at the same time. And that's what you have as an opportunity. But that's also a challenge, of course, to get everybody on board on that same target, but that's the starting point, the target, and then get everybody on board because it's about collaboration. And it's about using the mechanisms of the 4 different pillars as we use them, and I think I haven't seen any better models. And adding the policy side is probably the most relevant one. Because we have done in Refresh, and you know that was the starting point when we started about discussing if you have the opportunity to set up a program, what is the blueprint that has been designed based on hundreds of experience. And what we have done in the Netherlands, what I've done is added that policy side. Nobody had done that before, and I think you're in a unique opportunity to do that. And that means that now you have everybody together, and now it's about getting people to relax in their own position and role and play from that role. So the role of us, me being from the university, has completely changed. The university is in a different role than at first as a coordinator. The government is in a different role. They have a big responsibility in financing and running the consumer campaign, but we need to get, and we have businesses on board now, municipalities, provinces, education, etc. So that's running smoothly. But now the government is in the role like, how do we link to other more important policy areas, like climate change, like biodiversity, like the farm-to-fork approach, the Green Deal. And that's exactly what we're doing now with the government, is tying what are the key leverage points where you as a government can change the system so that's more profitable and more incentives for companies to actually start working on farm-to-fork prevention of food waste. And there's not that many countries in the world that have that position, because it asks also for collaboration across the different departments of the governments. And that's the challenge in the Netherlands, it's a challenge in Europe, and that's a challenge all over. Because if you look at departments, environment is relevant for environment, agriculture, finance, climate. You need to have them work together. That's the only way to have the impact.
And just on that point, there was an MOU that was being progressed with the Australian government involving all the federal departments that are involved in food and food waste. How's that going? Or shouldn't I bring that up?
Steve.
Sorry, that wasn't on the sheet, was it? Oops.
So we have been having discussions with our colleagues across the Australian government on pulling together an MOU. And what we're actually finding is we're having conversations with them naturally anyway. We're all very busy working in government and supporting the government of the day, and they've all got their own priorities, but where we're actually seeing the synergies and the linkages, we're connecting and making those connections and strengthening those relationships. Following the new government, our department, well before that, we were Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment for 2.5 years, and we established some really good connections with our agriculture colleagues, and 6 months ago we became a different department, and we've lost agriculture, but we have the climate change and energy folk in with us, or we're a new department actually. We haven't lost those relationships with agriculture. We're actually having regular conversations with them, you know, the Hort team, we were having conversations just the other day, and now that we're in with climate change and energy, we're making new connections, having other conversations. You would have seen Minister Plibersek talking about collaborations and working together, and she's all about us collaborating across government and not just operating in silos. And you know, it's great that we've got a government who is working towards net zero, and we're in with climate change and energy. So those connections and actually linking the food waste challenge to the climate change and the impact it's having on emissions is one really good benefit for us, as sad as it is, but it's a really good hook for us, and it's got the attention of Minister Plibersek. And obviously also the cost of living pressures across Australian households, that's another key thing for the government, but also seeing the food insecurity issues that's coming. And you know, the Food Bank's hunger report last month, those figures were quite staggering, and you know, it wasn't a really good read. So we're working across government and we're making those connections. Yeah. We can talk about the MOU later, Steve.
All right, I want to go to yourself, Mirjana. You, FIAL was really doing, well, did some great work in this area for a couple of years. First the roadmap, and there was also a number of events that were organised throughout that time. And then, of course, the feasibility study, which was actually done off your own financial backing, is my understanding. You've now been out of it for a year, I guess, since the feasibility study was delivered. How are you tracking? Is Australia doing all we need to deliver on those excellent roadmaps that were created by FIAL?
Great question, and it's really great to be here. And let me share with you, first of all, in terms of how it all started. And I think this is really important, and I just want to touch on what Peter said as well. FIAL, I wouldn't say we won the gig, but we actually got the gig to actually lead the development of the food waste roadmap. And partly we got that because of our role and responsibility across the food and agribusiness sector. Now, we cover the whole value chain, and I think that's really important. And in terms of the key lessons that we learned as we were doing developing the roadmap was that we were the neutral broker. You know, we didn't have an interest, and I congratulate the Australian government in terms of giving the task for us to do, because we were able to take it without having a bias, because we're looking at it holistically. And I think, Toine, you were saying about the whole of the value chain, systemic, and I think we have got that whole of the value chain perspective. The other role that we had, which was really important, was we were a facilitator, almost a conductor, and we brought everyone onto the stage and we leveraged everyone's expertise. We didn't actually do the work, and that's the beauty about it, is we got all of you to do the work, which is even great. But we also engaged extensively, and my team, it was good to see Sam and Carolyn and Mark, but you know, they worked tirelessly across to engage with yourselves, to understand what the industry associations are doing, but not only that, the associations and other groups, but also local and state governments, to understand what were the deep issues, to really understand what do we need to do to get to the root of the problem, but then also what kind of interventions are important. And depending on where you are in Australia, the context varies. And so it's really important to understand those contexts because you can't apply the same solution in all parts of the country. And the steering committee, Ronnie and I were on the flight together, and the steering committee was invaluable, provided invaluable advice, invaluable guidance, and I think without that, I think it would be really hard. But we also were able to use them as a sounding board, but they also helped us to connect through their networks to really get that greater reach. So it really allowed us to fast-track the development. I'll touch on the roadmap. I'm going about the roundabout way. But the last thing I want to touch on, which is really critical, we had very limited capability and capacity in Australia in terms of expertise. So you know what I say, go and poach it from overseas, and that's exactly what we did. And we partnered with yourself, Steve. We brought Mark Barthel over, and poor Mark had two hats on. He was moving around trying to do work with the CRC as well as trying to help us develop the roadmap. But that's how you accelerate. So I think to answer your challenge that we're saying, some countries are lagging, well, there is expertise that you can tap into, so I think we need to do more of it. So, we have the roadmap here, so that's one of the first tasks that we did, and the roadmap is actually an invaluable tool. It actually outlines the key elements of what needs to be done to achieve the target. What's really wonderful to see here at the summit, and also yourself, Steve, and Toine, and a lot of people are mentioning the great work that we're actually making inroads to achieving what were the key actions that are required. It's about the planning, the initiating, it's about the building, and it's about how do we review and keep amplifying. And I think we're starting to see now a bit of traction. So that's really great. It's great to see the voluntary commitment program. It's actually taking shape, the Food Pact, the fact you've got 25 signatories. If I recall correctly when I was reading, I think you were targeting 50. So I think...
Although if we look at the FIAL roadmap, it says for 2022, have 25 signatories.
Well, there you go, see? So perfect.
We're exactly
where we should be.
The roadmap indicated we should be 2 years ago.
Excellent, which is really great to see. But one of the other things that FIAL undertook, and this is something that we funded, and we've limited, it was the Commonwealth, but from a different department. So when you talk about collaboration, we report into Department of Industry. This was Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. But what we did was we felt it was imperative to start to look at the sector action plans, and we embarked on, Carolyn and Sam and Mark worked on the supply chain. They looked at food rescue, and those sector action plans were really critical because they cut across all the parts of the value chain of where we waste food. And what it allows us to do is give us that holistic view of the whole system. It allows us to understand the linkages between the different components, how they interplay, what are interventions, what are the learnings. And I think by having that holistic view was really important. And now, in terms of the board, and I see Jeff Starr, who was also on our board, in the audience. It's really wonderful to see that the feasibility study is important. And we did the feasibility study for two reasons. First of all, we wanted to understand, well, what's the baseline? And let's do it because it's really important to understand what the number is. But we also were trying to understand, well, what are all the inputs are going to make in the outputs? And Steve, you touched on the fact that, or I think it was the chair, commenting on it costs us $36.6 billion in terms of waste. So, but that's actually about $2,000 per person, per household a year. Could you imagine in this current climate, not only understanding that we could actually save that for a household, but also the actual input to carbon emissions is actually massive. It's 3% of Australia's annual emissions of carbon dioxide. So imagine if we tackle food waste, we not only are going to protect our scarce resources of what it takes to grow the food, but also we're going to be able to divert and impact climate as well through the carbon emissions. So I think that's a really valuable story. And, we fine-tuned the numbers. We worked with the audience, the cross-sector to really get the data, make it more robust. We developed scenarios, we developed business cases, we actually understand what's the return required, and it's also what's the combination needed to achieve the food waste. I mean, as you said, Steve, we are able to reduce the food waste by half, but I think it's really important we're hearing stories of should it be industry-led, should it be policy-led. The story isn't or, it's an and story. We all collectively have to put our muscle in, we have to lean forward to make it happen. And as you've said, the consumers make up 30% of the total food waste. And if the missing part of the puzzle is, how do we really get that campaign going, the National Consumer Behavioural Change Campaign, so we can educate consumers so they can do the right thing. And unprecedented action, we love the word unprecedented, we've had a lot of unprecedented events of late, but that unprecedented, we need unprecedented action if we're going to really accelerate. And I suppose what the feasibility study highlighted, that if we put the full throttle on and went into eighth gear, I wouldn't say 6, but the 8th gear, we could achieve not just 52% reduction, we could even go further.
Thank you for that. And yes, our vision is an Australia without food waste. So good segue into that. Toine, there's a question from the audience, and I encourage everyone to submit their questions through the app. Certainly Claire's worked out how to use it, so good on you, Claire. So we're going to go to Claire's first question. What can Australia learn from Europe in setting these bold policy targets and following them through with legislation?
A very good question. And I think what can be learned is do it differently than Europe has done, because you can accelerate much faster by getting everybody together and aligned. I mentioned in my talk, like Europe used to be leading this, but we see in the discussions now that since Europe has a very ambitious plan, the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, but it has not been communicated well, and it looks like in the negotiations with all the member states, Europe is a mess. So all the ambitions are slowing down, and now the next year will be very crucial. But the Commission is concerned that it won't get all the member states on board, aligned with all the targets, the bold targets they have set. So as a response, and I think that's also what I think is something that Australia can learn from, consumers are driving change. Consumers have driven the change to retailers to respond, because it's their positioning, it's their clients that they need to, because clients find it important that food waste is reduced. And that's the nice thing about this topic. Nobody is against reducing food waste if you do it in a positive way. That's why our campaign is always positive norm, food waste free. So it's not about hate or waste or whatever, it's always the positive mode. Learn from that, make it positive, because that helps to get more people on board. Okay. That campaign, it was branded like a way that all the stakeholders will say, we own this. So it's not a government run, it's not a company run, it's not one retailer run, it's run by everybody. So it's very important to make it a brand that everybody will say, we want to join this. We want to put in as much of our leverage that we can organize to make this happen. In the Netherlands, that worked. There are very few countries where they have found that model, that everybody says, we want to put in our efforts to make that happen. And then at the end, of course, it's the role of the government. Netherlands understand how to do that, and that's why they have made the pledge at the COP, saying like, we want to be one of the first countries promoting that Europe will focus on the full scope and will stick to the bold ambitions. Yesterday I was invited, because the European Commission is concerned, and also the President von der Leyen. She said, like, this is an important topic, but we're losing grip. So she has set up the idea of organizing a citizen panel across Europe. Learning also from what some countries are doing is that consumer driving the way. We need consumers' concerns to be addressed at the member states, because otherwise we are losing this fight with the member states. Companies will go on, they will continue. But if the policy won't change, companies cannot do it by themselves. So the European Commission has now decided to organize a citizen panel this year. So they invited me to be one of the experts. So I said yes, of course, because this is so important to create this driver point from climate, from NGOs, from citizens. Companies know what to do it. The solutions is not the issue, they are there. But it is now about bringing all the actors together to do this. And I think having this momentum and starting hopefully with a big campaign, if you do it systemically, use all that to create the movement and the urgency to the supply chain, and putting governments in a role to be outside the pillars working on what is really important, you're in a perfect position. After what you already have achieved. So I haven't said it yet, but compliments on what you have done in the last 5 years. It's really, really great if everything works out based on the roadmap. It's amazing. Yeah.
We met, I think it was at the OECD initially, but one thing when we met, you were running a program called Fusions. It's probably the biggest R&D effort that's occurred in the food loss and waste space in Europe, and before that there was, after that was the Refresh program. Yeah. Is there anything that was identified in those, were they 3-year programs, 4-year programs?
4-year programs?
2 4-year programs.
With 1 year overlap, yeah.
Yeah. Was there anything identified in those programs that we're just not doing at the moment in Australia?
I think when we first talked, Fusions was just finished, and the key element was work on a harmonized framework for measurement. Yep. And what we did within Fusions, given advice to the Commission, and that was embedded in the legislative proposal on what's the definition, and that led to harmonized measurement across Europe. You're already doing that, so that's great. Okay. In Refresh, it was much more about making a blueprint together with all the partners, including, of course, REP was an important partner for you. They were leading that work package on creating a blueprint on the national strategies. You've used that. So we don't need to talk about that. It's the next thing about what are the other things. What we did, and we still benefit from, is to do thorough consumer research. What is driving consumers, and and use that to make practical interventions. And that's what we did. I brought a few examples, like to make it very practical. What are the type of interventions that you can do to make consumers waste less on a very practical side? One of the elements is that we organize a national food waste free week where all of the partners come together. We just had the 4th version last month. And I think what is exciting, the Netherlands had 18 million people, all of them included. 7 million people actually saw something on food waste during that week. But what is the most important, 4 million people did something in their home, in their buying, in their behavior. But what is important, it all comes from a theoretical framework based on science, and we use that, for example, to understand in some cases you need to work more on the ability side, or sometimes more on the knowledge side, and sometimes more on the social norm. So for those areas where people know what to do but just don't do it, like saving the bread, we use a nudging campaign. Worked great. On shelf life, best before, use a campaign that continuously reminds people on best before, and use buy dates, what's the difference, and when you can use your own senses and repeat on that. So use that framework to make practical interventions, create the social norm, but also work on the knowledge level. And I think what has also been essential is to work on the education from primary, secondary, all professional levels. And that's in place now. And that creates a lot of momentum because you're training the next generation in their professional working position, and they are now changing the way companies think. So I mentioned the example of Unilever and other companies. What they do is to give young people the mandate to solve the problem. Change the KPIs of the salespeople, of the category managers, it works. But give young people the responsibility and the mandate to work, and they can solve it.
And to be honest, I think we need to be doing more in the education space, particularly at the school level education. It's pretty hit and miss whether schools incorporate it into their curriculum each year. So we can be doing a lot more there. I do want to get to some of the questions. Claire's got a bit of a cheeky one here, and I'll let you fight it out with her as to which country is going to be the first to halve food waste.
I don't know.
and then the other hand, conflicted there, I guess.
But it's also relevant to think about. It starts with the point where you began. Because it is 50%, yes, that's the target, but some countries who are lagging behind probably can go faster. So it's not the absolute. The absolute is probably more relevant than the other thing. And it's not a competition between a couple of countries. That's why I started like, we have 8 billion people and 25 million here, 18 million in the Netherlands. We should see how we can, not to be too much front runner, but to make certain that we get the rest also on board. That's why I think the champions and other activities have a very important role to play, that it is not a competition between 3 or 4 countries. No, we need to get hundreds of companies on board, or countries on board at the end. Yep. But I'm quite sure that the Netherlands will be one of the first, because that's what myself and my team get to work on every day. So, but yeah, maybe it could be Australia. We don't know.
It could be. I'm pretty competitive, if you didn't know.
Well, I was going to say, Steve, competition is good. I actually think we should have a front runner, because I think there should be a prize, because that would actually drive interest. I think there should be competition.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's also relevant is that like these companies, like I mentioned Unilever for the 3rd time now, it's inspirational to other companies. So I've now brought together like 10 companies and say, we want to learn from that. So can we not build only a Waste Warrior group in one company? Can we make a Waste Warrior Special Forces team to work together on this? And that's starting to work already.
Funny you should use that expression. We were at Government House in Canberra only a few weeks ago, and Waste Warrior was what Mrs. Hurley has set up in Government House, and they're doing a great job. So, I'll bring up another question here from Kat Heinrich, and this is to all panel members, so feel free to jump in. What's the biggest barrier preventing Australia from reaching its target to halve food waste? Do you want to go first, Peter, or do you want to start
and then I'll let
Mirjana?
I think it's awareness.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people aren't aware of how much you actually waste, and I'll speak for myself, who loves to, I was brought up with the school thought you go shopping once a week, you plan for your week of food, and of course I've got big eyes and small stomach, and what happens is I always end up buying a lot, and then I feel guilty of how I'm going to utilise it. So I think educating people, and I think educating people, as you said, Steve, from a very young age, so kids can understand food, but also understand where food comes from, how it should be stored, how do you preserve it. Also, too, sometimes food does get wasted for whatever reason. It can get bruised, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. So I think education, starting from a very young age, will really help really drive the push and responsibility. But it's awareness of food waste, but also the consequences, understanding that it takes resources to grow that food. It takes water, it takes land, it takes human capital. It costs money to put fertiliser and what have you on the soil, but then it takes money to take it and bring it to your home, and then if it's wasted. So there is lots of things that we can do to actually raise awareness, and it should start very early on.
Yep.
And I think coming off awareness, we've also got the behaviours, why do we do what we do? What can we do better? We've done it this way because that's what we as children, or as what as parents did, like inherited behaviours. We can manage our food better, we can plan, we can meal prep, we can do lists, we can see what's in the fridge and pantry, we can reduce our portion sizes, we can not be tempted by what's staring in front of us at the supermarket. Recognising our own behaviours and what we can do better to not have that food waste.
Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe to add an additional point, I think, and it's nice that Kat asked this question. She came over to Wageningen about a month ago, and I showed her one of the interventions we worked on, and showed her also what is the blocking factor why not everybody is taking that innovation. That's the innovation about, and in the Netherlands about 8 to 9% of all the bread is being returned end of the day, not sold. The same situation here. So,
except in South Australia.
Yeah, and that's what we talked about. And now this is also at the desk of our minister. If the companies are not going to do it because they're in a lock-in position, they want to change, but they find it difficult. That's now we asked the minister, maybe there should be a ban on returns of bread, like in South Australia. And that's the role that policy can play. If companies can solve it themselves, create additional urgency, and if they won't do it, penalize it or make legislation, because these are the things that will work. Ultimately, if they're not going to do it themselves, not because they don't want to, but because they are in a lock-in position. And that's important to pilot that, to scale that. The solutions they are there, but it is the unknown that sometimes you have to push into the unknown. And I think what is definitely, like I mentioned, is responsibility. We see that the bigger retailers, the bigger companies, they will take responsibility, scope 3, because that's where their role is. It's not about what they do in their own operations or using sustainable energy. They should do that. 90% of the impact in the food industry is in the production side. So if manufacturers and retailers will take the responsibility there, including consumers, that is the game changer. And that is going to happen now. So we need, and that was pushing also Albert Heijn, we need the NGOs to focus fully on that. Like, your responsibility is not in what you do in yourself, it's about the full supply chain. And that is the game changer now.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. We've only got about 6 minutes left, so we may not get through all the questions, but we've got a question here from Gal McLeod, and I'll ask you to keep the answers fairly brief. It's around retailers and brand owners driving ROI through increased sales. What initiative is in place to drive the brand owners to strategise, plan and go to market with highly relevant packaging sizes? The CRC has done quite a bit on the role of packaging in reducing food waste. So who would like to tackle that one around the packaging sizes and what brand owners should be doing?
It's the same issue in Europe. And I mentioned the reduction of 30% of food waste at consumers in the Netherlands. A key reason for that is that portion size on average has been halved. But because of the pressure now on plastics, we see portion sizes are growing again. But if you look at the pure facts and the environmental impact of the packaging, on average is 5%, and of the product is 95%. So whatever you can do to protect the product from being wasted, it's always better. And of course, plastics need to be designed for circularity and recycled, etc. No disagreement on that. But getting rid of packaging, increasing portion sizes, that's the wrong road. We should move in the direction of making it fit for purpose, and on the same side, work on, so on both win-wins, to create more recyclable packaging. But we cannot do it without plastic. We never can.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to tackle that? If not, I have got one more question. And there's a few people that have asked variations of this question. And it's one I often get asked, and I mentioned in my talk, how do we know how well we're doing? Currently, we've done 2 baselines. They're about a $200,000 exercise each. How do we get real-time data on how we're tracking against Goal 12.3? What's Europe doing in terms of big data approaches to getting some real-time feedback on how you're tracking?
Yeah, Europe is also struggling, and we get the data from more like public information. That's what's being reported to the Commission, but that's not very granular. So the approach that we made is get the data from the companies. So the Target Measure Act, so we get the data from the retailers, from the manufacturers, and if they're sufficient, we can benchmark and publish. That's the way forward, to my opinion. And if
so that's the industry side, but it doesn't necessarily cover the consumer side.
That's right. So on the consumer side, we still do every 3 years a mapping.
Right.
We have done this year, so I know the result. We can publish later on. So you need to do that. There's not a good alternative yet.
Right.
But that is something to work on. And in the Netherlands, we have a group of like 4 or 5 companies that's already doing measurements in food service sectors. The technology is ready for them to do it in home. So with your mobile phone, you can track your data. Easy way. And it's just about thinking how a business model could look like. But the next step for those companies is to make a very easy device to track at home. The only thing we need to do is to make it a positive experience. That you as a person get positive feedback like restaurants do, because it helps them to save at least 30-40% of food waste and buy less if they track their waste. And consumers is potentially the same. So the technology is ready, the companies are willing to invest, there's sufficient investment money to do so, but now it's about how to get, and that's I think why this consumer campaign is so important, to make it positive with the new generation, to share this data, and then it will happen somewhere, maybe here.
Maybe we'll get a research proposal around that at the CRC, nice. Just a hint. Mirjana, FIAL's done some great work around agri-tech and big data and so on. Anything in the wind that you know of that we could be using? There is,
and I think, you touched on data. As soon as you say data, you start thinking about privacy laws and privacy and how, information's power. or some people think information's power, and it also, but the most important thing about data, it helps inform decision making, so you do need it. I do know that the research and development corporations are working on an Oz data exchange, which is like a highway that allows data to go on and off. There are some big issues around privacy and how do you manage data, because obviously if someone gets access to the data that you don't want someone else to see for whatever reason, so, you know, especially particularly business competition is important, but there is areas of competition where we can pre-competitive that we can work on. So I do know that the Department of Agriculture is actually investing in the Oz Data Exchange as the RDCs, but that's an area that I think could really help this, because it could be the highway of how we can put the data and get the data to where it needs to be. But then you need to have visibility and like a dashboard that captures it. There's no point in having data if you can't get access to it and people can't see it and can't use it to do the analysis. So I think there's lots of things that we can do. So watch that space.
Yep. Peter, did you have any final?
I was just interested in how we would make it a positive experience and not deter people from continuing their efforts. Obviously, you know, we'd be looking to get more data at the 3-year stage, but how we can make it positive, is that an opportunity in the nationwide behaviour change campaign to be getting that data, to be doing the M&E on how we're progressing.
Great. Look, we've got a very big clock in front of us and it's ticking down with 1 minute left to go. Look, I hope people have taken a lot from this opening session. We've started at the international level around how the world's tracking, how we're tracking as a country. We've brought it down to the national level, what's happened over the last 5 years, what we need to do over the next 8 years. You've heard of the new government's priorities, they're not so new now, but the new government's priorities, and you know, a range of different aspects here. I really hope you've enjoyed this opening session. You've got a lot from it. Was there any final comment in the 30 seconds we've got left? Any burning comment?
Absolutely. It's unprecedented action. Everyone has to stand up and actually push forward. We have to be proactive, not reactive.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, collective effort.
Excellent.
Across the country.
It's all about collaboration, and this is of course the great opportunity that we can actually see and meet each other, and I will be back hopefully sometime to see the great progress, and always people can approach us to learn what's happening outside. Yeah, you know how that works, so happy to help.
Fantastic. 2, 1, dead on time. Morning tea will be served outside. We really hope you enjoyed the summit and we look forward to talking to all of you. Thanks.